Welcome to American Boring History. Today, we're going to talk about one of the greatest civilizations ever to grace this planet, the Roman Empire. Grab your coffee, settle in, because this is a long one. 2 hours. We are going all the way. Let's start at the very beginning. Not with Julius Caesar, not with Augustus, not even with the Republic. We're starting with a she-wolf, twin brothers, and a hill by a river that would one day shake the entire world. The year is traditionally given as 753 BC. According to Roman legend, the city of Rome was founded by Romulus, one of twin brothers, born to a Vestal virgin named Rhea Silvia and the god Mars. When the twins were born, a jealous king named Amulius ordered them thrown into the Tiber River, but they survived, cradled in a basket, washed ashore, and suckled by a she-wolf. Now, historians are pretty confident this story is myth, but myth tells us something important about how Romans saw themselves as people chosen by the gods, hardened by struggle, destined for greatness. That self-image would drive them for over 1,000 years. The actual archaeological evidence suggests that Rome began as a collection of small villages on the 7 hills along the Tiber River in central Italy, probably around the 10th to 8th centuries BC. These villages gradually merged, they traded, they farmed, they fought, and slowly something began to grow.
Rome's earliest political form wasn't an empire or even a republic, it was a kingdom. According to tradition, Rome had 7 kings from its founding until 509 BC. Some were Roman, some were Etruscan, members of the powerful civilization to Rome's north that profoundly influenced early Roman culture. The first king was Romulus himself, the legendary founder who, after killing his brother Remus in a dispute over city walls, became the absolute ruler. He organized Rome's early social structure, dividing citizens into patricians, the noble class, and plebeians, the common people. He created the Roman Senate, 100 elder advisors. This 3-part structure, king, senate, people, would echo through Roman history even after the kings were gone. After Romulus came Numa Pompilius, a wise and peaceful king credited with creating Rome's religious institutions. Then Tullus Hostilius, a warlike king who expanded Roman territory by destroying the rival city of Alba Longa. Then Ancus Marcius, who built Rome's first bridge across the Tiber. Then came the Etruscan kings, Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and finally Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. This last king was a tyrant. Arrogant, cruel, and contemptuous of the Senate, he ruled by fear. His son committed a horrific crime against a Roman noblewoman named Lucretia, who took her own life after the assault. That act of violence sparked a revolution. In 509 BC, Roman aristocrats, led by Lucius Junius Brutus, expelled the Tarquin family and abolished the monarchy forever. Rome would never again be ruled by a king, at least not in name. Something new was born, the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic was a remarkable experiment in shared governance, at least for the aristocracy. Instead of a king, Rome would now be ruled by 2 consuls, elected annually, each with the power to veto the other. The idea was brilliant. No single person could dominate. Power was spread, checked, and balanced. But let's be honest, the early republic was not a democracy in any modern sense. Real power rested with the patricians, Rome's hereditary noble class. The Senate,
packed with patrician elders, controlled finances, foreign policy, and the law. The plebeians, who made up the vast majority of Romans, had almost no political power. This inequality led to centuries of internal conflict, known as the conflict of the orders. Plebeians fought generation after generation for basic rights. They threatened to leave Rome entirely, to abandon the city and found their own. This radical tactic, called the secession of the plebs, actually worked. Patricians needed plebeians as soldiers and workers. They could not ignore them forever. Over roughly 2 centuries, from about 494 to 287 BC, plebeians won a series of major victories. They gained their own representatives called tribunes of the plebs, who had the power to veto legislation. They had their laws written down in the 12 tables, so patrician judges could no longer distort unwritten law. Eventually, plebeians could hold the highest offices: consul, censor, and priest. By around 287 BC, the conflict of the orders was largely resolved. Decisions made by the assembly of the people, the concilium plebis, became binding on all Romans. It wasn't equality, but it was progress, and a more unified Rome was now ready to look outward. Rome's conquest of Italy was not a grand imperial plan. It was messy, gradual, and often reactive. Romans fought because they were threatened, because they wanted land, and because they had a remarkable military machine that kept winning. In the early Republic, Rome was just one of many competing powers in central Italy. There were the Etruscans to the north, the Samnites in the mountains to the south, Greek colonies along the southern coast, a region Romans called Magna Graecia, the Gauls to the north, who terrifyingly sacked Rome itself around 390 BC. That Gallic sack was a catastrophe. Gauls swept down from the Po Valley, shattered a Roman army, and burned much of the city. According to legend, only the Capitol Hill, warned by geese whose honking alerted the guards, was saved. Rome rebuilt, and rebuilt fast, and it built something else too, a burning desire to never be so vulnerable again. Rome fought 3 great wars against the Samnites between 343 and 290 BC. The Samnites were tough mountain warriors and inflicted humiliating defeats, including forcing an entire Roman army to pass under a yoke of spears in the disastrous Battle of the Caudine Forks in 321 BC. But Rome kept coming back. Each defeat made them adapt, improve, and return stronger. By around 275 BC, after defeating the Greek king Pyrrhus, a brilliant general whose victories cost him so many men that we still use the term Pyrrhic victory today, Rome had achieved dominance over the entire Italian peninsula. They didn't always destroy their enemies. Often they incorporated them, giving some peoples full Roman citizenship, others Latin rights, others allied status. A Roman-led confederation now stretched from the Alps to the toe of Italy's boot. Now Rome faced a rival worthy of its ambitions, Carthage. Founded by Phoenician settlers from the city of Tyre, Carthage sat on the northern coast of Africa, roughly where modern Tunisia is today. It was the greatest maritime power of the Western Mediterranean, controlling trade routes, colonies in Spain, Sardinia, Corsica, and much of Sicily. 3 times Rome and Carthage clashed, in wars so enormous they reshaped the ancient world. We call them the Punic Wars, Punic coming from the Latin word for Phoenician. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BC, began over Sicily. Rome had never really been a naval power, but they needed a fleet to fight Carthage. According to Roman tradition, they captured a wrecked Carthaginian warship and used it as a blueprint. Then they built 100 ships in just 60 days. They even invented a new weapon, the corvus, a massive spiked boarding bridge that let Roman soldiers do what they did best, fight hand-to-hand on enemy ships as if they were solid ground. Rome won. They took Sicily, their first overseas province. 20 years later, the Second Punic War began, and it produced one of history's greatest military geniuses, Hannibal Barca of Carthage. In 218 BC, Hannibal made one of the boldest moves in military history. He marched an army, including war elephants, from Spain through southern France, across the Alps in winter, and descended into Italy. The Romans were stunned. Hannibal then proceeded to destroy Roman army after Roman army. The worst came at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC. Hannibal, outnumbered, surrounded a Roman army of perhaps 70,000 men and annihilated them. It remains one of the most studied tactical masterpieces in military history, still taught at war colleges today. Rome lost an estimated 50,000 soldiers in a single afternoon. It was catastrophic. But Rome did not surrender. They refused to negotiate. They raised new armies. They waited Hannibal out. And eventually, Rome carried the war to Africa, defeating Hannibal at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. After the Second Punic War, Carthage was broken. Stripped of its fleet, its overseas territories, forced to pay massive war indemnities, and forbidden from making war without Rome's permission. But Rome's hardliners, led by the relentless Senator Cato the Elder, were not satisfied. Cato allegedly ended every speech in the Senate on any subject at all with the phrase, "Carthage must be destroyed." The Third Punic War, from 149 to 146 BC, was Rome at its most cold-blooded. Carthage had actually recovered economically, which alarmed Rome. Using a flimsy pretext, Rome declared war. The Carthaginians fought desperately, house by house, street by street, in one of antiquity's most brutal urban battles. When it was over, Rome leveled the city, sold the survivors into slavery, and plowed salt into the earth. The story about salting the earth may be legendary, but the destruction was absolutely real. In the same year, 146 BC, Rome also sacked the great Greek city of Corinth. The message to the Mediterranean world was clear. Rome was the supreme power, and defiance meant annihilation. By the mid-2nd century BC, Rome controlled Spain, North Africa, Greece, and was deeply involved in the affairs of the Eastern Mediterranean. Roman merchants, soldiers, and administrators flooded the known world. Wealth poured back into Rome, but it flowed very unevenly. The conquests created enormous profits for the Roman elite, who bought up land abandoned by small farmers off fighting wars. Hundreds of thousands of war slaves flooded Italy, working on great estates called latifundia. The backbone of Roman society, the small independent farmer, was being crushed, and that social crisis would soon tear the Republic apart. The late Roman Republic is one of the most dramatic political stories in human history. A century of reform, revolution, civil war, and ultimately the collapse of republican government. It begins with two brothers who tried to save Rome and paid with their lives. Tiberius Gracchus was elected tribune of the plebs in 133 BC. He was from a noble family. His grandfather had defeated Hannibal. His father had been a celebrated general. He could have lived a comfortable life of aristocratic privilege. Instead, he chose reform. Tiberius proposed redistributing public land that wealthy senators had illegally occupied to landless Roman poor. It was legally sound, it was socially necessary, and it made the Senate furious. When Tiberius sought re-election, technically against tradition, a mob of senators and their followers beat him to death with chairs in the Forum, Rome's first major political assassination in centuries. His body was thrown into the Tiber. 300 of his supporters were also killed. 10 years later, his younger brother Gaius Gracchus picked up the cause. Even more brilliant and more radical, Gaius pushed through a series of reforms: land redistribution, subsidized grain for the poor, extension of citizenship, and checks on senatorial corruption. Again, the Senate responded with violence. Gaius was murdered or forced to have a slave kill him, along with 3,000 of his supporters. The Gracchi brothers represented a fault line that would define Rome for the next century. On one side, the optimates, those who upheld the power of the Senate and the traditional order. On the other, the populares, politicians who appealed to the masses and used popular assemblies to push through change. These were not ideological parties in a modern sense. Most Roman politicians switched sides when convenient, but the tension between them would eventually destroy the Republic.
Into this turbulent world stepped Gaius Marius, a military genius from a non-aristocratic family, a so-called new man in Roman politics. Marius was elected consul an unprecedented 7 times. He reformed the Roman army, making it a professional force rather than a citizen militia. Soldiers now served 16-year contracts and were equipped by the state. This was enormously effective militarily. It was also politically transformative. Professional soldiers were loyal to their general, the man who paid them, led them to victory, and promised them land when they retired. This created a dangerous new dynamic. Roman armies could become the personal tools of their commanders, and Roman commanders would use them. Marius's rival was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, an aristocratic general of equal military brilliance and far fewer scruples. In 88 BC, a dispute over command of a lucrative eastern campaign escalated into something Rome had never seen. Sulla marched his legions on Rome itself. Roman soldiers attacking Rome. The unthinkable had become possible. Sulla took the city, briefly reformed things to his liking, and then left for the east. Marius came back, took Rome for himself, and died shortly after his 7th consulship. Then Sulla returned in 83 BC, won a devastating civil war, declared himself dictator, not the temporary office Romans had used before, but an open-ended personal dictatorship, and proceeded to publish proscription lists, lists of enemies whose property was forfeited and who could be killed by anyone with a reward. Thousands died. Sulla eventually retired voluntarily, an almost inexplicable act of restraint for the time. He died peacefully in 78 BC. But the precedent he had set was catastrophic. Roman politics would never fully recover. The question was no longer whether someone would make himself permanent ruler of Rome. The question was only who and when. The generation after Sulla produced 3 men who would dominate Rome: Gnaeus Pompey, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and Gaius Julius Caesar. Each was extraordinary. Together they formed an informal political alliance in 60 BC that historians call the First Triumvirate, 3 men who essentially divided Rome's power among themselves.
Pompey was Rome's greatest living general, the man who had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in just 3 months, who had reorganized the entire eastern Mediterranean, who had conquered new territories from the Caucasus to Jerusalem. His troops called him Pompey the Great, and it wasn't empty flattery. He was Rome's most celebrated soldier. Crassus was the richest man in Rome, possibly the richest man in the ancient world. He had made his fortune through real estate, silver mines, and buying up property from Sulla's proscription lists. He owned a private fire brigade. When a building caught fire, his men would arrive and negotiate the purchase price while the building burned. Only then would they put out the fire. He also crushed the great slave revolt of Spartacus in 71 BC, crucifying 6,000 slaves along the Appian Way as a warning. And then there was Caesar. In 60 BC, Julius Caesar was in his early 40s, politically ambitious but financially strapped and deeply in debt. He was from an ancient patrician family. The Julii claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself, but he had positioned himself as a champion of the popular cause. He was charming, brilliant, and absolutely ruthless when he needed to be. The triumvirate gave Caesar the one thing he needed most, the command of an army and a province where he could win military glory and wealth. He was assigned Gaul, the vast territory of modern France, Belgium, and parts of Germany. What followed was one of the most spectacular military campaigns in history. From 58 to 50 BC, Julius Caesar conducted a war of conquest across Gaul that changed both Rome and Europe forever. He described it himself in his memoirs, The Gallic Wars, written in the third person with polished propaganda that made every victory seem inevitable and every setback seem irrelevant. Caesar fought hundreds of battles. He built a famous bridge across the Rhine River in just 10 days, not because he needed to cross it, but to demonstrate Roman engineering and impress the Germanic tribes. He conducted 2 raids into Britain, mysterious, foggy, barbarian Britain, at the very edge of the known world. Roman citizens were electrified. The Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix was Caesar's greatest opponent, a brilliant, charismatic leader who united most of Gaul against Rome in 52 BC. His tactics were sound: avoid pitched battle, use guerrilla warfare, destroy food supplies to starve the Romans. But Caesar was relentless. At the siege of Alesia, Caesar besieged Vercingetorix's hilltop fort while simultaneously building a second set of fortifications facing outward to fight off a Gallic relief army. He was besieging a fortress while being besieged himself, and he won both battles simultaneously. The human cost of the Gallic Wars was staggering. Ancient sources, possibly exaggerated, claim Caesar killed 1 million Gauls and enslaved another million. Modern estimates are lower, but the demographic and cultural devastation of Gaul was enormous. Celtic culture in what is now France was effectively destroyed. Latin replaced local languages. Within a few generations, Gaul would be one of Rome's most thoroughly Romanized provinces. Caesar returned from Gaul fabulously wealthy, commanding veteran legions utterly loyal to him and more powerful than any single Roman had been in a generation. The Senate was terrified. They demanded he lay down his command, and Caesar had a simple answer: no. The Rubicon River was a small, unremarkable stream in northern Italy, but it marked the boundary between the Roman province of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper. Roman law strictly forbade any general from crossing it with his army. To do so was treason, an act of war against the Roman state itself. In January of 49 BC, Julius Caesar stood on the northern bank with his most loyal legion and made a decision that would change Western civilization. He crossed the Rubicon. "The die is cast," he reportedly said. It was not metaphor, it was declaration. The civil war that followed was almost shockingly swift. Pompey and his senatorial allies had expected Caesar to hesitate, to negotiate, to back down. Instead, he moved like lightning. Town after town in Italy surrendered without a fight. Soldiers who had served under Caesar years before switched sides to join him. Pompey, utterly unprepared, fled Italy with much of the Senate. Caesar did not execute his enemies. He practiced what he called clementia, mercy. He pointedly refused to post proscription lists or execute political opponents. It was both a genuine philosophical commitment and brilliant politics. People who surrendered to Caesar lived, which made people far more likely to surrender. Caesar fought Pompey's forces in Spain, defeated them. He pursued Pompey to Greece. At the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, Caesar defeated Pompey's much larger army through superior tactics. Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge. He was murdered on the beach as he arrived, killed by an Egyptian official hoping to curry favor with Caesar. When Caesar arrived and was shown Pompey's severed head, he reportedly wept. Pompey had been his son-in-law. They had been partners once. Now the greatest rivalry in Rome was over. Caesar arrived in Alexandria, Egypt, in 48 BC and walked into a civil war. The young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII and his older sister Cleopatra VII were fighting for control of Egypt. Caesar, as de facto ruler of Rome, was the most powerful person in the Mediterranean world. His favor was everything. Cleopatra understood this perfectly. According to the most famous version of the story, possibly embellished by later writers, she had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters, rolled up in a carpet or a sack, so she could speak to him before her brother's agents could intercept her. Whatever the exact circumstances, the meeting between the 52-year-old Roman general and the 21-year-old Egyptian queen sparked one of history's most famous love affairs. Cleopatra was brilliant, educated, politically astute, and spoke 9 languages, including Egyptian, which none of her Greek Ptolemaic ancestors had bothered to learn. She understood how to make herself indispensable. Caesar backed her in the resulting Alexandrian War, defeating her brother's forces. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile. Cleopatra became queen. She bore Caesar a son, whom she named Caesarion, Little Caesar. Caesar stayed in Egypt for months, far longer than military necessity required. He and Cleopatra took a lavish cruise up the Nile. Roman senators back home were appalled. Their general, their dictator, was lounging in the most decadent palace in the world while Rome waited. Eventually, Caesar returned to his campaigns, crushing resistance in Asia Minor so quickly that he sent Rome the famous 3-word dispatch, Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. By 45 BC, all organized resistance was finished. Caesar was the undisputed master of the Roman world. Caesar, now back in Rome, moved fast. He was appointed dictator for life, an unprecedented title that permanently concentrated power in one man. He packed the Senate with his supporters, including many Gauls. He reformed the calendar. The Julian calendar would be used across Europe for 1,600 years and forms the basis of our calendar today. He planned massive building projects, a new library, a canal through the Isthmus of Corinth. He was not destroying Rome, he was remaking it. But a faction of senators could not accept what he represented: the end of the Republic, the end of their power, the end of the idea that no single man could rule Rome alone. They called themselves liberatores, the liberators. Their leader was Gaius Cassius Longinus, a sharp-tongued, calculating man who had fought against Caesar and been pardoned. And the man they chose as their public face was Marcus Junius Brutus, a man Caesar had genuinely loved, possibly even his son by an affair with Brutus's mother. The conspirators planned to kill Caesar on the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BC, at a Senate meeting. There were 23 men involved, which is remarkable in itself. 23 people kept the same secret for months. Caesar received warnings. A soothsayer told him to beware the Ides of March. His wife Calpurnia begged him not to go after terrible nightmares. He went anyway. In the theater of Pompeii, as the Senate meeting began, one conspirator presented Caesar with a petition and grabbed his toga. The others closed in. Caesar was stabbed 23 times. According to Suetonius, only one wound was fatal, a thrust to the chest. He died at the base of Pompey's statue, pulling his toga over his face to die with dignity. Caesar was dead. The liberatores assumed Rome would celebrate. Instead, the city fell into shock. Caesar had been deeply popular with the common people, with his soldiers, with the provincial populations he had governed. And he had an heir, his great-nephew and adopted son, Octavian, a thin, sickly 18-year-old who was at that moment studying in Greece. The story was far from over. The aftermath of Caesar's murder was chaos. Mark Antony, Caesar's most trusted general and lieutenant, took control of the situation initially. At Caesar's public funeral, he read Caesar's will aloud. Caesar had left his gardens to the Roman public and 300 sesterces to every Roman citizen. The crowd went insane. The liberatores, who had expected to be hailed as saviors, were instead driven from Rome by a mob howling for vengeance. But the 18-year-old Octavian moved with astonishing political skill for someone so young. He traveled to Italy, claimed his inheritance, and immediately began paying Caesar's personal bequests to the people out of his own pocket, or rather out of borrowed money. He was buying loyalty, loudly, publicly, relentlessly. His name was now officially Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. People would remember who had killed his father. A brutal period of political maneuvering followed. Antony, Octavian, and a third general named Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the first, this was a legally recognized office with extraordinary powers. And they began their rule with immediate, systematic murder. The proscriptions of 43 BC killed hundreds of the senatorial class. Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, the voice of the Republic, the man who had exposed the Catilinarian conspiracy and written volumes on Roman law and philosophy, was hunted down and beheaded on Antony's personal orders. His hands, which had written those speeches against Antony, were nailed to the speaker's rostrum in the Forum. The triumvirists then pursued the liberatores east. At the two battles of Philippi in 42 BC, Brutus and Cassius were defeated. Both committed suicide. The Republic's last defenders were dead. The triumvirate then divided the Roman world. Octavian took the west, including Italy and Spain. Antony took the east, the rich Greek-speaking lands of Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. Lepidus got Africa. It was an uneasy arrangement. It could not last. Mark Antony was brilliant but self-destructive. He was a superb soldier, charismatic and generous to a fault. In the East, he met Cleopatra, who had by now survived Caesar's assassination, outlasted her rivals, and ruled Egypt with formidable political skill. The meeting between Antony and Cleopatra at Tarsus in 41 BC is one of the most described scenes in ancient history. Cleopatra arrived on a golden barge with purple sails, rowed by silver oars, accompanied by music, perfume, and costumed servants. She was dressed as the goddess Aphrodite. The effect was calculated and overwhelming. Antony was captivated. They began an affair that would become legendary. Antony increasingly based himself in Alexandria, living in splendor at Cleopatra's court. He and Cleopatra had 3 children. He began distributing Roman provinces to their children in a ceremony Romans found outrageous, the donations of Alexandria. He seemed to Romanize, to be going native, abandoning his Roman identity for an Oriental queen. Octavian, meanwhile, was consolidating power in the West with methodical efficiency. He waged a brilliant propaganda war against Antony, portraying him as a traitor to Rome, a drunk, a man enslaved to a foreign queen who wanted to rule Rome from Alexandria. When Antony divorced Octavian's sister Octavia to officially marry Cleopatra, it was political gift-wrapping for Octavian. In 31 BC, war came to a head at the naval battle of Actium off the coast of Greece. Octavian's admiral Agrippa outmaneuvered Antony's fleet. Cleopatra's ships, inexplicably, broke off and fled. Antony followed her. It was the end. Within a year, Octavian had invaded Egypt. Antony, receiving a false report that Cleopatra was dead, fell on his sword. Cleopatra, faced with the prospect of being paraded as a captive in Octavian's triumph, killed herself, reportedly by allowing an asp to bite her. Egypt fell to Rome, and Octavian stood alone. Octavian was now the most powerful person in the world, but he had watched his adoptive father Caesar be murdered for appearing too openly monarchical. He would not make the same mistake. His genius was to maintain the forms of the republic while gutting its substance. In 27 BC, Octavian made a theatrical gesture. He announced he was restoring the republic and giving all his powers back to the Senate and people of Rome. The Senate, stacked with his supporters and terrified of renewed civil war, begged him to reconsider. He graciously agreed to keep certain powers for himself: command of all the major armies, control of the provinces where armies were stationed, tribunician power giving him veto over all legislation, and his person sacrosanct. The Senate gave him a new honorific, Augustus, the revered one, the sublime. He preferred another title, Princeps, first citizen, not king, not dictator, just the leading citizen, first among equals. Everyone understood it was a fiction, but it was a comfortable, workable fiction, and after a century of civil war, Romans wanted comfort and workability above almost anything. Augustus ruled for 44 years, from 27 BC to 14 AD. It was the longest reign of any Roman emperor, and arguably the most consequential. Under Augustus, Rome was transformed. He found Rome a city of brick, he reportedly said, and left it a city of marble. He rebuilt temples, constructed new public buildings, created the Praetorian Guard, an elite bodyguard force stationed in Rome, established a permanent professional army with fixed pay and retirement benefits, reformed the tax system, rebuilt roads, and created a network of imperial postal couriers. The Roman Empire, as a functioning administrative entity, was really Augustus's creation. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, is typically dated from the beginning of Augustus's reign in 27 BC to the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD. That's over 2 centuries of relative peace and stability across an empire stretching from Scotland to the Euphrates, from the Rhine to the Sahara. It was, by ancient standards, a miracle of governance. During this period, roughly 60 to 70 million people lived under Roman rule, perhaps a quarter of the world's total population at the time. They were connected by an extraordinary infrastructure, over 400,000 kilometers of roads, many of them stone-paved and still visible today. Roman roads were so well built that modern highway routes in Europe still follow their paths. The Roman economy during the Pax Romana was the most integrated and sophisticated the world had seen. Grain from Egypt and North Africa fed the cities of Italy. Spanish olive oil and wine traded across the empire. Silk came from China along the Silk Road. Roman coins have been found in India, and Indian pepper was common in Roman kitchens. Roman cities were extraordinary. Rome itself had perhaps 1 million inhabitants, a population not matched by any European city until London in the 19th century. It had massive apartment blocks, public baths capable of serving thousands simultaneously, aqueducts bringing fresh water from mountains miles away, public latrines, a sewer system, free grain distributions, and spectacular public entertainments. The Colosseum, completed in 80 AD, could seat 50,000 people. The cultural flourishing was equally remarkable. Under Augustus and his successors, Roman literature reached its peak. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, Rome's national epic. Horace wrote his odes. Ovid wrote the Metamorphoses. Livy chronicled Roman history. This was the Latin literature that would be copied by monks throughout the Middle Ages and rediscovered during the Renaissance, shaping all of Western literature.
Augustus died in 14 AD at the age of 75, having outlived most of his preferred heirs. Power passed to his stepson Tiberius, a capable, if gloomy, administrator who ruled competently but was increasingly paranoid in his later years, withdrawing to the island of Capri and ruling through intermediaries while his praetorian prefect, Sejanus, terrorized Rome with treason trials. After Tiberius came Caligula, in the ancient sources one of history's most notorious rulers. The historian Suetonius fills pages with tales of his cruelty, depravity, and apparent madness. Whether all these stories are true is debated by modern historians. Much of the anti-Caligula tradition was written by senators who hated him, but he certainly executed people casually, humiliated the Senate, and made erratic decisions. He was assassinated by the Praetorian Guard in 41 AD after just 4 years in power. The Praetorians then found the next emperor hiding behind a curtain in the palace, Claudius, Caligula's uncle, whom everyone had dismissed as a bumbling invalid. But Claudius turned out to be a shrewd, hard-working administrator. He oversaw the actual conquest of Britain in 43 AD, something Caesar had only briefly attempted. He expanded Roman citizenship and improved the bureaucracy. He was likely murdered by his wife Agrippina in 54 AD, who wanted the throne for her son by a previous marriage. That son was Nero, the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Nero's early reign was actually competent, guided by the philosopher Seneca and the praetorian prefect Burrus.
But as he asserted independence, things deteriorated. He murdered his mother, executed his first wife, kicked his second wife to death while she was pregnant. In 64 AD, a great fire burned much of Rome. Nero reportedly responded with a massive rebuilding project and used the cleared land to build his vast pleasure palace, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. Nero blamed the fire on Christians, a small, misunderstood cult at this point, launching Rome's first state persecution of Christianity. In 68 AD, facing revolts, Nero lost the support of the army and Senate and fled Rome. "What an artist dies with me," he reportedly said before killing himself. The Julio-Claudian line was over. Nero's death triggered the year of 4 emperors, 69 AD, in which 4 different men claimed the throne within 12 months: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, a gruff military man from a non-senatorial family who had been suppressing a revolt in Judea when Nero died. Vespasian's victory in the brutal civil war proved a fundamental truth. Emperors were made by armies, not by birth or Senate approval. Vespasian founded the Flavian dynasty and proved an excellent emperor, practical, fiscally responsible, with a wry sense of humor. When criticized for taxing public urinals, he reportedly held a coin to his son's nose and said, "Money has no smell." He rebuilt Rome after the Civil War and began construction of the Flavian Amphitheater, what we now call the Colosseum. Before Vespasian could complete it, his son Titus finished the Jewish war by destroying Jerusalem in 70 AD. The destruction of the Second Temple, one of the defining catastrophes in Jewish history, was commemorated in Rome with the Arch of Titus, which still stands in the Roman Forum today. Titus became emperor after Vespasian and was enormously popular, only to die after just 2 years, during which he dealt with the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, which buried the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, and a devastating plague. Pompeii's sudden burial preserved a snapshot of Roman daily life so extraordinarily complete that archaeologists are still excavating it today. Titus's brother, Domitian, completed the Flavian line, reigning competently for 15 years, but with an increasingly autocratic style that alienated the Senate. He was assassinated in 96 AD, and the Senate cheerfully condemned his memory, smashing his portraits and erasing his inscriptions in a practice called damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. After Domitian's assassination, the Senate chose an elderly, respected senator named Nerva as emperor. Nerva's most important decision was also his last major one. He adopted Trajan, one of Rome's best generals, as his successor. This began a remarkable sequence that Edward Gibbon, the great 18th century historian, would call the period of the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Each chose his successor by adoption rather than blood, picking the best available man rather than simply promoting a son. The result was 5 consecutive, competent, intelligent rulers spanning nearly a century, from 96 to 180 AD. Gibbon wrote that this was the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. Trajan was the greatest conqueror since Augustus. He pushed Rome to its maximum territorial extent, adding Dacia, modern Romania, and Mesopotamia to the empire. His column in Rome, still standing, tells the story of his Dacian campaigns in a spiraling frieze of carved reliefs, essentially a stone comic strip that remains one of the finest pieces of Roman art. Hadrian was Trajan's opposite, less interested in expansion than in consolidation and organization. He personally toured almost every province of the empire, inspecting troops, reforming administration, commissioning buildings. Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, 73 miles of stone fortification marking the empire's northern edge, is still one of the most impressive Roman remains in the world. He rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome in its current form, with its perfect concrete dome that still astonishes engineers today. Antoninus Pius reigned for 23 peaceful, prosperous years. His successor, Marcus Aurelius, was arguably the greatest philosopher-king who ever actually ruled, a practicing Stoic philosopher who wrote his private meditations in Greek, never intending them for publication. The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius are still read today by people seeking wisdom about duty, mortality, and the good life. But Marcus Aurelius also spent much of his reign fighting on the Danube against Germanic tribes pressing on the northern frontier. The Pax Romana was under pressure. The 2nd century's grace was giving way to the 3rd century's agony. Let's pause the political narrative for a moment and look at what life in the Roman Empire was actually like for ordinary people. Because most of this history has been about generals and emperors, but most Romans weren't generals or emperors. The Roman social pyramid was steep. At the top, the emperor and his family. Below them, the senatorial class, roughly 600 families who provided Rome's top magistrates and generals. Below them, the equestrian order, a broader, wealthy class who ran the imperial bureaucracy, commanded auxiliary troops, and dominated provincial commerce. Below them, the decurons, local aristocrats who ran city councils across the empire. And then the vast majority, free citizens of modest means, artisans, shopkeepers, farmers, soldiers, freedmen, former slaves who had been freed and were legally free but still bound to their former masters by social obligation. And at the bottom, slaves, who might make up 20 to 30% of Italy's population during the height of the empire. Roman slavery was brutal. Slaves had no legal rights. They could be beaten, tortured, sexually exploited, and killed with impunity. But Roman slavery was also more complex than simple race-based enslavement. Slaves came from all over. Greek intellectuals often enslaved by Roman masters who valued their education, German captives working in mines, Syrian merchants reduced to servitude. Some slaves rose to remarkable positions. Educated slaves served as secretaries, doctors, and teachers. A few were freed and accumulated wealth. Daily life for a typical Roman in a city like Rome was densely urban. Most people lived in multi-story apartment buildings called insulae, crowded, noisy, fire-prone, with no running water above the ground floor. They ate breakfast standing up from street food stalls, the ancient world's fast food restaurants, complete with food storage jars still visible in Pompeii today. They went to the baths daily, not just for hygiene, but for socializing, networking, and exercise. The bath complexes were Rome's combination gyms, spas, and social clubs.
Roman religion was not a single unified system, but a sprawling, tolerant, constantly expanding collection of cults, rituals, and beliefs. Romans worshipped the Olympian gods, Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Venus, and the rest, but they also eagerly adopted foreign deities. Mystery religions from the East, like the cult of Isis from Egypt, the cult of Mithras from Persia, spread widely through the empire. Romans generally didn't care what gods you worshipped, as long as you also performed the proper state religious rituals that kept the Roman gods happy. This tolerance had one exception: monotheistic religions that refused to acknowledge any other gods. Jews had a long-standing exemption from Roman religious requirements. Judaism was ancient and recognized, even if misunderstood. But a new movement emerging from Judaism in the 1st century AD posed a different challenge. Jesus of Nazareth was executed by crucifixion in Roman Judea under the governor Pontius Pilate, probably around 30 or 33 AD. His followers believed he had risen from the dead and was the Son of God. This movement spread with remarkable speed. By Paul's missionary journeys in the 40s and 50s AD, Christian communities existed in major cities across the empire. By the end of the 1st century, Christians numbered perhaps in the tens of thousands. By 300 AD, perhaps 5 to 10% of the empire's population. Romans were initially confused about Christians rather than hostile. Nero's persecution in 64 AD was local and brief. Most emperors during the Pax Romana had no systematic policy against Christians. But Christians refused to sacrifice to the state gods or honor the divine emperor, both civic duties in Roman eyes. They met secretly, used coded symbols, spoke of eating the body and blood of their god. Rumors spread about them. Periodic persecutions flared, under Decius in 250 AD, under Valerian in 257 AD, and most severely under Diocletian starting in 303 AD. But persecution paradoxically strengthened the Church. Christians who died for their faith, martyrs, became inspirational figures. The Church organized, built institutional structures, developed theology. It was becoming something that could survive even the fall of the empire it inhabited. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, and the Golden Age effectively died with him. His son, Commodus, was the first emperor in nearly a century to inherit power through birth rather than adoption, and he was a catastrophe. Convinced he was the reincarnation of Hercules, he appeared in the arena personally as a gladiator, renamed Rome in the months of the year after himself, and ruled through terror and caprice until his household had him strangled in his bath in 192 AD. What followed was the crisis of the 3rd century, from roughly 235 to 284 AD, arguably the most severe internal crisis Rome ever faced. In those 49 years, Rome had over 50 emperors, almost all of them military commanders elevated by their troops and quickly killed by the same troops when they failed to deliver enough plunder or lost enough battles. The average reign was less than 2 years. While the center fell apart, external pressures intensified. Germanic peoples, Goths, Alemanni, Franks, pressed on the Rhine and Danube frontiers with increasing organization and ambition. The Sasanian Persian Empire in the east was a formidable military power, capable of fielding heavy cavalry and war elephants. In 260 AD, the Emperor Valerian, the first Roman emperor ever captured in battle, was taken prisoner by the Persian king Shapur I. Persian propaganda reliefs show Valerian kneeling before Shapur, his wrists gripped in the Persian king's hand. The empire actually fragmented during this period, a breakaway Gallic empire in the west, a Palmyrene empire in the east, led by the remarkable Queen Zenobia, who controlled Egypt and Syria and actually dared to claim the title of Augustus.
The Roman Empire's presumed permanence was being shaken to its foundations. Economic collapse accompanied the military crisis. Currency was debased. Coins that had been reliably silver contained less and less actual silver as emperors needed money to pay troops. Inflation spiraled. Trade declined. Cities shrank. The elaborate integrated economy of the Pax Romana fractured. Plague killed millions. It seemed entirely possible that Rome might not survive.
Rome was saved, temporarily, by a series of tough, capable emperors from the Illyrian military, who hauled the empire back from the brink through sheer force of will and administrative ruthlessness. The most important was Diocletian, who became emperor in 284 AD and ruled until 305. Diocletian understood that the empire was simply too big for one man to govern effectively, especially militarily. His solution was the Tetrarchy, 2 senior emperors called Augusti and 2 junior emperors called Caesars. 4 men would rule the empire together, each responsible for a region. Diocletian would be the senior Augustus of the East, based at Nicomedia in what is now Turkey. Rome itself, symbolically central but strategically inconvenient, was no longer the empire's administrative capital. Diocletian also undertook the most comprehensive reform of Roman administration since Augustus. He doubled the size of the army, reorganized the provinces into smaller units with more local control, fixed prices throughout the empire in his famous Edict on Maximum Prices, a massive document listing fair prices for hundreds of goods and services, the ancient world's most ambitious price control legislation, which didn't really work but tells us extraordinary amounts about the Roman economy. He also launched the last and most systematic persecution of Christianity, the Great Persecution, beginning in 303 AD. Churches were destroyed, scriptures burned, clergy imprisoned, thousands died. But the church survived. Diocletian abdicated voluntarily in 305 AD, in remarkable parallel to Augustus's earlier theatrical resignation, and retired to grow cabbages at his palace on the Adriatic coast, which still stands today as the core of the Croatian city of Split. The Tetrarchy fell apart almost immediately after Diocletian's abdication. Emperor sons demanded inheritance, civil wars broke out, and from the chaos emerged the man who would most dramatically change the course of Western history, Constantine. Constantine won his way to power through a decade of civil wars, finally defeating his last rival Licinius in 324 AD to become sole emperor. But the decision that made him immortal came earlier, at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 AD. According to various accounts, and the details differ depending on who was telling the story, Constantine experienced some kind of vision or dream before the battle. He saw a Christian symbol in the sky or in a dream, along with a message, "In this sign, conquer." He had his soldiers paint the Chi Rho symbol, the first 2 Greek letters of Christ's name, on their shields. They won, and Constantine attributed his victory to the Christian God. Whether this was genuine religious conversion, political calculation, or both, the consequences were world historical. In 313 AD, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, establishing religious tolerance throughout the empire and specifically ending persecution of Christians. He gave the church money, land, legal status. He built enormous basilicas, including the original St. Peter's in Rome and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He summoned and personally presided over the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, at which church leaders attempted to resolve theological disputes about Christ's nature. The Nicene Creed, still recited in Christian churches today, emerged from this council. Constantine also moved the capital of the Roman Empire. In 330 AD, he dedicated a new city on the site of the ancient Greek colony of Byzantium, at the strategic crossroads of Europe and Asia. He called it Constantinople, Constantine's city. It would remain the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire for over 1,000 years. Constantine was baptized only on his deathbed in 337 AD, a common practice at the time, since baptism washed away all previous sins. By the time he died, he had transformed Rome from a pagan empire into a Christian one. The Roman Empire and Christianity were now permanently intertwined.
Constantine's dynasty ended in internal bloodshed, a pattern depressingly familiar in Roman history. His three sons divided and then fought over the empire. After a series of short reigns and civil wars, the throne fell to Theodosius I in 379 AD, the last emperor to rule the entire Roman Empire alone. Theodosius made Christianity not just tolerated, but mandatory. In 380 AD, his Edict of Thessalonica declared Nicene Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire. In 391 AD, he banned all pagan worship, closing temples, forbidding sacrifices, outlawing the ancient religions that had sustained Rome for 1,000 years. The Olympic Games, which had been held every 4 years since 776 BC, over 1,100 years of athletic tradition, were ended. Everything pagan was suspect. When Theodosius died in 395 AD, he divided the empire between his two young sons. Arcadius took the east, ruling from Constantinople. Honorius took the west, ruling eventually from Ravenna in northern Italy. This division was intended to be administrative, not permanent. No one announced the Roman Empire is now two empires, but the West and East would never again be united under a single ruler. The western half was by now the weaker half. Italy was wealthy but geographically vulnerable. The Rhine and Danube frontiers were under constant pressure. The economy was struggling, and the army increasingly relied on Germanic soldiers, foederati, who fought for Rome but were not Romans, and whose loyalties were, at minimum, complicated. Germanic peoples had been settling inside Roman borders for over a century, sometimes peacefully, sometimes by force. The Visigoths, in particular, fleeing pressure from the Huns moving in from the Central Asian steppes, had been allowed to settle south of the Danube in 376 AD. When Roman officials abused them, cheating them of food rations, even selling them their own children as slaves in exchange for dog meat, they revolted. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD was a catastrophe that shook the empire to its foundations. The Emperor Valens led a Roman army against the Visigoth rebels and was killed along with perhaps 2/3 of his army. It was the worst Roman military defeat since Cannae 5 centuries earlier. The Visigoths were not expelled after their victory. Rome no longer had the strength to expel them. Instead, they were settled inside the empire under their own leaders, under a treaty that made them nominal subjects but effectively independent. The Huns, Central Asian nomadic warriors of terrifying military skill, were the catalyst driving wave after wave of Germanic peoples into Roman territory. They shattered the Gothic confederacies north of the Danube, pushing the Goths into Rome.
In 406 AD, the Rhine froze, and a massive mixed horde of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi simply walked across the frozen river into Gaul. Roman defenses collapsed. Spain was overrun. North Africa was threatened. Then came the unthinkable. On August 24, 410 AD, the Visigoths, under their king Alaric, sacked Rome. It was the first time the city had been captured by an enemy in 800 years. The psychological shockwave rolled across the empire. St. Jerome, translating the Bible in Bethlehem, wrote, "My voice sticks in my throat. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. It felt like the end of the world." Alaric's sack was actually relatively restrained. Churches were respected, limited by the standards of ancient warfare, and Rome recovered physically. But something had broken spiritually. The eternal city had fallen. If Rome could be sacked, what was permanent? Augustine of Hippo, the greatest Christian theologian of the era, responded with a massive work, The City of God. His argument, Rome's fall was not God's punishment. The earthly city had always been temporary. What mattered was the city of God, eternal, heavenly, beyond the reach of Visigoths or Vandals. This theological framework gave Christianity a way to survive the fall of the empire and gave Western culture a way to process the catastrophe. The Western Empire limped on for decades after Alaric's sack, a ghost of its former power. Real power increasingly rested not with the emperors, many of them children or puppets, but with military commanders called magistri militum, often of Germanic origin. Men like Stilicho, who was half Vandal, and later Aetius, sometimes called the last of the Romans, were the real rulers of the West. The Vandals under Gaiseric crossed from Spain to North Africa in 429 AD and conquered Rome's most productive provinces, modern Tunisia, Algeria, and Libya. They built a powerful kingdom and a fleet that raided the Mediterranean at will. In 455 AD, they would sack Rome again, this time more thoroughly than Alaric, spending 2 weeks systematically looting the city. The word vandalism comes from them. Then there was Attila, king of the Huns, the scourge of God, arguably the most feared human being of the 5th century. From 434 to 453 AD, Attila forged a vast Hunnic empire stretching from the Rhine to Central Asia and extracted enormous tribute from both the Eastern and Western empires through threats of devastation. He destroyed entire cities, leaving smoking ruins from Germany to Persia. In 451 AD, Attila invaded Gaul. What met him was extraordinary. A coalition force of Romans and Visigoths, bitter enemies who had fought each other for decades, under the Roman general Aetius. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains was one of the largest battles in ancient history. Casualty estimates are wildly inconsistent, but massive. Attila was stopped and retreated. The Hunnic Empire, dependent on Attila's personal genius, collapsed after his death in 453 AD, reportedly from a nosebleed on his wedding night. Aetius, who had saved the West at the Catalonian Plains, was murdered by the paranoid Emperor Valentinian III in 454 AD. Valentinian himself was murdered the following year by Aetius's supporters. The last generation of Western Roman emperors was a rapid succession of nonentities controlled by Germanic generals. The traditional date for the fall of the Western Roman Empire is 476 AD. The last Western Roman emperor was a boy named Romulus Augustulus, a name combining Rome's legendary founder with its greatest emperor. in cruel historical irony. His father, Orestes, a former secretary of Attila the Hun, had placed him on the throne. The Germanic soldiers who made up most of the Roman army demanded land in Italy, 1/3 of Italian territory. When Orestes refused, a chieftain named Odoacer led a mutiny, killed Orestes, and deposed Romulus Augustulus. But rather than proclaiming himself Emperor of the West, Odoacer did something novel. He sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, told the Eastern Emperor Zeno that the Western Empire no longer needed its own emperor, and ruled Italy himself as king. It was, in many ways, a quiet and undramatic end. No great battle, no apocalyptic scene. A boy emperor was exiled to a comfortable villa in southern Italy, where he presumably lived out his days in obscure safety. The Eastern Emperor in Constantinople barely noticed. He had other problems. But historians have wrestled for centuries with the question of what exactly happened in 476 AD and why. Edward Gibbon's 18th-century masterwork, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, blamed Christianity for making Romans weak and otherworldly. Later historians blamed economic decline, lead poisoning, military overextension, institutional collapse. Modern scholarship tends to emphasize transformation rather than destruction, a gradual process by which Roman institutions adapted, merged with Germanic ones, and became something new. Because Rome did not simply disappear in 476 AD. The Eastern Roman Empire continued for nearly another 1,000 years, eventually known as the Byzantine Empire, finally falling to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 AD. Roman law formed the basis of legal systems across Europe and the world. The Catholic Church preserved Latin language and Roman administrative structures. Germanic kings desperately claimed Roman titles and Roman legitimacy. Rome haunted the medieval world, even in its absence.
The Eastern Roman Empire, what modern scholars call the Byzantine Empire, though its inhabitants always called themselves Romans, is one of history's great underrated stories. It lasted from 330 AD, when Constantinople was founded, to 1453 AD, when the city fell to the Ottoman Turks. That's 1,123 years, longer than the Western Roman Empire lasted from Augustus to Romulus Augustulus. The Eastern Empire had enormous advantages over the West. Constantinople was nearly impregnable, protected by water on 3 sides and the massive Theodosian walls on the 4th, walls so formidable they would not be breached for 1,000 years. The eastern provinces, Greece, Anatolia, Syria, Egypt, were more urbanized, more prosperous, and more defensible than Italy and the Rhine frontier. The greatest Byzantine emperor was Justinian I, who ruled from 527 to 565 AD. Justinian was obsessed with restoring the old Roman Empire, what historians call his Reconquista project. His general Belisarius, one of the finest military commanders of any era, reconquered North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and southern Spain from the Visigoths. For a moment, the Mediterranean was a Roman lake again. But Justinian's conquests were too expensive and too fragile. Italy was devastated by 20 years of war and could barely recover. And while Belisarius fought in the west, Persia pressed on the east, and the plague of Justinian, possibly the first outbreak of bubonic plague, killed perhaps 1/4 of the empire's population. The reconquered territories were gradually lost after Justinian's death. Justinian's lasting legacy was legal. The Corpus Juris Civilis,
His comprehensive codification of Roman law formed the basis of legal systems across Europe and the world. When European universities rediscovered it in the 12th century, it became the foundation of modern legal education. Justinian also built the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, whose massive dome was an engineering marvel that stood as the world's largest church for nearly 1,000 years. Let's step back now and survey what Rome actually gave the world. Because Rome's legacy is not abstract, it lives in your daily life in more ways than you probably realize. Start with law. Roman law is the foundation of legal systems across continental Europe, Latin America, and significant portions of Africa and Asia. The basic principles that you take for granted in any civilized legal system, innocent until proven guilty, the right to confront your accuser, the distinction between civil and criminal law, legal contracts and property rights, these emerged from Roman jurisprudence. Roman jurists of the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD developed a sophisticated body of legal reasoning. They distinguished between jus civile, Roman civil law applying to citizens, and jus gentium, the law of peoples, principles held to be universal and applicable to all humans, regardless of origin. This concept of universal natural law, applicable to all people everywhere, was enormously influential on later ideas of human rights and natural law philosophy. The Justinianic Code, compiled in the 6th century AD, preserved and systematized this legal tradition. When medieval European universities began teaching law again in the 12th century, Roman law was their primary text. Napoleon's Civil Code of 1804, which spread across Europe and the Americas with French conquest and influence, was explicitly modeled on Roman law. Louisiana in the United States and Quebec in Canada still use civil law systems derived from Rome rather than the English common law tradition. Roman governmental concepts were equally influential. The very word republic comes from the Latin res publica, the public thing, the commonwealth. The Senate, adopted by the United States and dozens of other countries as the name for their upper legislative chamber. The concepts of veto, referendum, and magistrate are all Latin words describing Roman political institutions. The founders of the United States were obsessed with Rome, reading Cicero, studying Polybius's analysis of the Roman mixed constitution, designing buildings that looked like Roman temples.
Latin did not die with Rome. It became the language of the Catholic Church, of European scholarship, of science, of law. The Romance languages, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, Catalan, and more, are all direct descendants of Latin. Together, Romance languages are spoken today by over 1 billion people. Even English, which is Germanic at its core, absorbed enormous quantities of Latin, first through the Church, then through the Norman French conquest of 1066, then through the Renaissance's deliberate borrowing of classical vocabulary for science and philosophy. Perhaps 30 to 40% of English vocabulary is ultimately Latin in origin. When you use words like legal, civil, military, urban, library, aquifer, census, calendar, forum, arena, auditorium, campus, you are speaking Latin. Roman architecture transformed the visual world. The Romans didn't invent the arch or the dome, but they perfected them and used them on a scale never before attempted. Roman concrete, opus cementitium, was a revolutionary material that allowed the construction of the Pantheon's 43-meter dome, the Colosseum's massive stands, and the vast vaulted halls of the imperial baths. This concrete was so durable that Roman structures still stand across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East after 2,000 years. Roman engineering achievements were staggering. The Romans built over 400,000 kilometers of roads, many of them stone-paved, engineered with drainage ditches, milestones, and posting stations. Roman roads were the backbone of the empire's military and commercial power. So many European roads still follow Roman routes that you can literally drive on paths laid out by Roman surveyors 2,000 years ago. Roman aqueducts delivered clean water to cities at a scale not matched again until the 19th century. The aqueduct system of Rome itself delivered over 1 million cubic meters of water to the city daily. That's roughly 1,000 liters per person. Segments of Roman aqueducts still stand in Spain, France, Turkey, and Jordan. The Pont du Gard in southern France, a 3-tiered aqueduct bridge 50 meters high, was built in the 1st century AD and still astonishes visitors with its scale and elegance. The most profound legacy of Rome may be religious. Constantine's conversion transformed Christianity from a persecuted minority faith into the official religion of the world's greatest empire. The organizational structure of the early church was explicitly Roman. Bishops governed territories called dioceses, a Roman administrative term. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, claimed primacy over all other bishops, in an echo of Rome's primacy in the empire. The Catholic Church preserved Roman learning through the early medieval period that followed the Western Empire's fall. Monasteries copied manuscripts, Virgil, Cicero, Ovid, Livy, Caesar, that would otherwise have been lost. The Church used Latin as its universal language, maintaining a transnational community of scholars across Europe's fragmented kingdoms. When the Renaissance rediscovered classical antiquity, it was largely this monastic preservation that made rediscovery possible. The Roman calendar, reformed by Julius Caesar, gave us our modern system. We still have 365 days, a leap year every 4 years, and months with the same names: January from Janus, March from Mars, June from Juno, July from Julius Caesar himself, August from Augustus. When you write the date today, you are using a system Julius Caesar commissioned. Roman names saturate our culture. The planets of our solar system, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, are all named for Roman gods. The days of our week, Saturday from Saturn, Sunday and Monday from the sun and moon, follow Roman tradition. Medical terms, legal terms, scientific terms, philosophical terms, all Latin. The very alphabet you're reading right now is the Roman alphabet, adopted and adapted from the Etruscan and Greek alphabets and carried across the world by Roman conquest and Christian missionaries. Western civilization is, in very large measure, a conversation with Rome. The Renaissance was a self-conscious return to Roman models. The Baroque architecture of Catholic churches deliberately evoked Roman imperial grandeur. The American founders designed a republic with a Senate and consulted Roman history obsessively. Napoleon crowned himself emperor in a ceremony consciously evoking Augustus. Mussolini called his movement fascism, from fasces, the Roman symbol of authority. Even modern science uses Latin nomenclature.
The question of why Rome fell is one of history's great debates. Edward Gibbon identified 17 causes in his 6-volume masterwork. Modern scholars have proposed dozens more. Let's survey the main theories. The military explanation focuses on the transformation of the Roman army. From a citizen-soldier force defending the Republic, Rome shifted to a professional army, then increasingly to Germanic foederati, allied troops who were not Roman citizens and whose loyalties were personal rather than civic. By the late Empire, the army that was supposed to defend Rome was largely composed of the same peoples threatening its frontiers. The economic explanation emphasizes the unsustainable cost of defense. As barbarian threats multiplied, military spending consumed increasingly larger shares of imperial revenue. Currency debasement caused inflation. Trade declined. The elaborate economic integration of the Pax Romana fragmented. Tax burdens crushed the middle class. Small farmers who couldn't pay taxes surrendered their land to large landowners in exchange for protection, a process that looks remarkably like the beginning of medieval serfdom. The political explanation points to the failure of succession. Rome never developed a stable, accepted method for transferring power. Every emperor's death was a potential crisis. Military commanders and their armies were permanent king-makers and king-destroyers. The energy and resources consumed by internal political competition, civil wars, assassinations, purges, were enormous. The environmental and demographic explanation, developed by modern historians, emphasizes disease. The Antonine plague of the 160s AD, the plague of Cyprian in the 250s AD, the plague of Justinian in the 540s AD, these pandemic events killed millions and disrupted populations and economies in ways that political resilience could not overcome. Climate change also played a role. A warm period that had favored Roman agriculture was giving way to cooling and instability. There's one more major school of thought worth examining, and it's the most influential in modern scholarship. Instead of asking, why did Rome fall, these historians ask, did Rome fall or was it transformed? The transformation argument, associated with historians like Peter Brown and Walter Goffert, emphasizes continuity rather than catastrophe. Germanic kings who took over Roman territories did not simply destroy Roman civilization, they actively sought to maintain it, because Roman civilization was enormously prestigious and practically valuable. Odoacer, who deposed the last Western emperor, governed Italy using Roman administrative structures and Roman officials. Theodoric, the Ostrogothic king who ruled Italy from 493 to 526 AD, was so committed to Roman culture that Cassiodorus, his Roman secretary, wrote his official letters in impeccable Latin. In this view, what happened was less a sudden catastrophic fall and more a long, gradual mutation. Roman institutions absorbed Germanic practices. Germanic kings absorbed Roman legitimacy. Latin evolved into Romance languages. Roman law fused with Germanic custom. Roman cities contracted and changed but survived. The Catholic Church preserved enormous amounts of Roman cultural content in new forms. The truth is probably some combination of all these explanations. There was genuine catastrophe. The Western provinces really did become less urbanized, less literate, less economically complex in the early medieval period compared to the height of the empire. Real knowledge was lost. Real capacity was destroyed. Life for ordinary people in Western Europe in the 2nd century was harder and shorter than it had been in the 2nd. But Rome was also genuinely, permanently present in everything that followed. Medieval Europe was haunted and shaped by Rome. Its church, its law, its language, its architecture, its literature, its very self-image. The Holy Roman Empire, founded by Charlemagne in 800 AD, was a direct claim to Roman succession. So was the Church of Rome. So is the Western legal tradition. So are the languages you and I are using right now. Rome has never stopped fascinating us. Every generation rediscovers Rome and finds in it a mirror for its own concerns. The Renaissance was literally a rebirth, the conscious attempt to revive ancient Roman and Greek culture after the perceived barbarism of the medieval period. Humanist scholars hunted through monastery libraries for Roman manuscripts. Architects studied Roman ruins. Painters depicted Roman scenes. Sculptors imitated Roman statues. The very idea of Western civilization as something distinct, continuous, and precious is inseparable from the Renaissance recovery of Rome. The 18th century Enlightenment used Rome as a political laboratory. Roman history offered case studies in republicanism and tyranny, in the dangers of military power, in the responsibilities of citizenship. Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall, begun in 1776, not coincidentally the year of the American Revolution, was both a historical masterpiece and a political meditation. The American founders read it. They called themselves Publius and Brutus and Cincinnatus in their political writings. They built their capital to look like a Roman temple. The 19th century found different Romes. Napoleon's Rome was imperial, triumphal, expansionist. Victorian Britain's Rome was a model for imperial governance of distant peoples. Classical education, learning Latin and Greek, reading Caesar and Cicero and Virgil in the original, was considered essential preparation for governing an empire. Our own century continues the fascination. Hollywood has given us Gladiator, Spartacus, Ben-Hur, Rome. Mary Beard's brilliant popular histories have brought Roman social life to millions of readers. Video games and fantasy fiction return endlessly to Rome. The meme asking, "How often do you think about the Roman Empire?" which went viral because so many men apparently think about it constantly, is funny precisely because it captures something true. Rome is still in our heads. Let's revisit some of Rome's most extraordinary individuals, not just as narrative characters, but as historical forces whose decisions shaped millions of lives. Julius Caesar stands first in most people's minds, and with good reason. His military genius, demonstrated across Gaul, Britain, Spain, Greece, Egypt, Asia Minor, and Africa, was extraordinary. His political genius was subtler, but equally remarkable. The ability to project power while maintaining the fiction of republican virtue, to make enemies into allies through clemencia, to communicate with Roman citizens directly and compellingly through both his military commentaries and his political theater. His assassination showed both his fatal miscalculation, he trusted his enemies too much, and Rome's fatal flaw. The Republic could not survive the concentration of power that centuries of conquest had made inevitable. Augustus surpassed Caesar in lasting achievement. He solved the political problem Caesar never could: how to hold supreme power in a culture ideologically committed to republican government by creating the Principate, the most elegant political fiction in history. He gave Rome 44 years of stable rule, a transformed infrastructure, a golden age of literature, and a template for imperial governance so successful it lasted in modified forms for centuries. Cicero deserves mention not as a general or an emperor, but as a mind. Rome's greatest orator and one of its greatest philosophers, Cicero articulated the principles of republican government, natural law, and civic duty in forms that would directly shape Enlightenment political thought. His letters, hundreds of which survive, give us the most intimate window into any individual's life from the ancient world. His execution by Mark Antony was Rome's most significant cultural loss. And Hadrian, the emperor who built walls and traveled his empire, represents something else in Rome, the administrative genius, the man who understood that empire is not just conquest, but maintenance. His lifetime of inspection, reform, and building created the institutional fabric that made the Pax Romana function. His library in Athens, his villa at Tivoli, his pantheon in Rome, these are the works of a man who understood that beauty, order, and permanence were political acts.
We've spent nearly 2 hours now with Rome. From a she-wolf nursing twin babies on a hill by a river, to the fall of Constantinople in 1453, to the Roman roads still visible under European highways, to the Latin words in your vocabulary right now. What does Rome mean? Not what it meant to the Romans, but what it means to us, looking back across 2 millennia. Rome means scale. The sheer ambition of what Rome attempted and achieved is staggering. A single city organizing the affairs of 60 million people across 3 continents, binding them together with roads and laws and language and money and trade, maintaining that system for centuries. No other civilization before the modern era came close. Rome means the relationship between power and justice, and how often they diverge. Roman history is full of extraordinary injustice: the massacre of Gauls, the enslavement of conquered peoples, the persecution of Christians and Jews, the brutal suppression of slave revolts, the casual violence of gladiatorial spectacle, the systematic execution of political opponents. Rome built its monuments on the backs of the enslaved and the conquered. And Rome means impermanence. The most powerful empire the ancient world had ever seen, with its marble monuments and iron legions and million-strong capital city, is now ruins, museum exhibits, and Italian countryside. The Colosseum, which once echoed with the roar of 50,000 spectators, stands today as a tourist attraction, its interior stripped of everything valuable, its arena floor gone, its underground tunnels open to the sky. The Forum, where Cicero argued and Caesar walked, is a field of broken columns and toppled arches. Sic transit gloria mundi. Thus passes the glory of the world. Rome knew this about itself. Roman literature is haunted by awareness of mortality and mutability. The Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, meditated on it. Virgil's Aeneid is suffused with melancholy about the cost of greatness. And yet Rome also built for permanence, carved in stone, wrote in durable Latin, built roads meant to last forever. Perhaps that paradox, the human desire to create something lasting in a world where nothing lasts, is Rome's deepest, most universal truth. And that brings us to the end of our journey through the Roman Empire, from the she-wolf and the 7 hills, through the Republic's glorious and tragic arc, through the centuries of the Pax Romana and the slow disintegration of the Western Empire, through the Byzantine survival and the transformation of classical civilization into something new. We covered 1,000 years of history in roughly 2 hours. We missed enormous amounts: the full story of Roman art and sculpture, the remarkable world of Roman women, the complex history of Rome's relationships with Judaism and early Christianity, the details of Roman provincial life from Britain to Syria,
the full story of the Byzantine Empire, the extraordinary lives of dozens of figures I only mentioned in passing. But I hope you leave this video with something useful, a sense of Rome as a living, breathing civilization, not just marble and togas, but real people making desperate decisions in real crises, building systems of extraordinary complexity and beauty, creating things that would outlast them by 2,000 years and counting. The next time you drive on a road that follows a straight line through countryside for no obvious reason, that might be a Roman road. The next time you use a legal term, look up a scientific name, or say the date, you're speaking Latin. The next time you sit in a domed building, or look at a cathedral, or read a law, or think about what a republic is supposed to mean, Rome is there. That's what empires do when they're great enough. They don't end, they transform. They become the ground we walk on, the language we speak, the ideas we think with, the institutions we argue about. Rome ended in 476 AD. Rome is still here. Thanks for watching American Boring History. If you made it to the end of a 2-hour Roman Empire video, you are exactly our kind of person. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and we'll see you next time.